Welcome back to the course. In this part, we'll be going over or back over our player to go over some basic OOP or object-oriented programming principles by using a handler system to compose our scenes. Let's first talk about the object-oriented programming stuff, and before you panic or skip ahead, just know I struggled to understand this myself. When I first learned about OOP, every explanation or example of any kind really kind of just broke my brain. So with that in mind, I won't give you a super intricate explanation that needs a degree to understand. Instead, I actually come up with something a little more visual and kind of super simple. And it's going to be through one of my favorite things, flowcharts. So let me pull that up real quick. And now let's go over the general concept that we're going to be going for with this kind of handler system and how OOP kind of functions. So if we look here, what we've got is our kind of player scene and how a player scene is set up, right? We've got the overarching player, which is the character body 2D. Then we have a sprite 2D, collision shape, and animation player, all kind of as nodes within this scene. Now, when it comes to OOP, or at least the component or handler system that we're going to be using, we've got to think about this in a very interesting way. Inside the actual player, there is the player.gd script. Now, that script will handle pretty much everything from movement to jumping to input, right? That's actually, that can be a bit of a problem sometimes because you can end up with this really, really large script. And of course, if you plan on, I don't know, creating either another player or another enemy of some sort, you will end up having to rewrite a lot of that code again. Well, handlers will basically be in control of doing that certain action and just be another node you can attach, like a sprite 2D. So say you want to look at movement, for example. Movement code for simple movement, i.e. left and right in this case, will be in its own little handler, and that will be called the movement handler. And that itself will be in control of that movement. So the player will just have that attached to it, and it will just call functions based off of that. And we'll kind of get into that and how that works in a second. But if I come over to here a little bit more, you'll see here that I've kind of set this up in a very specific way. We have the player, which is the character body 2D, the sprite, the collision shape, and the animation player. And then down here, the blues and purple, we have the components or handlers that we're going to be using. We have an input handler. This will handle key presses and certain inputs that we do on our keyboard. That will feed into the movement handler and will make the movement handler do things. And it will also feed into a jump handler, which will make the jump handler do things. So what do these things do individually? The purple one specifically, I've designed purple to basically be this is a player-specific component, whereas the blue ones are entity-specific components, meaning everything else will be able to use these, providing they have something that can do input, or in this case, give them the variables they need. So for the player, if we want to move left, we need to know if the character or the person is actually pressing left, right? So in that sense, we need to feed that input into the movement handler. So the movement handler goes, okay, you're pushing left, I need to move left. And the same with jumping. We need to know if they've pressed space. So the jump handler will go, have I pressed space? It'll come from this, go into here, and then I'll go back up into the player and affect the player. Now, to kind of show you a bit more power in this, remember, blue specifically is components, like entity-wide components, not just designed for the player. So if I come over here more, this is an enemy. It'll have a sprite, collision shape, animation player. It will then have an enemy-specific component, which is the AI handler, but it will also use the movement and jump handler, like we have on our player. But because they're not player-specific anymore, we can just add those nodes to the enemy. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, as I said, components are going to be their own unique thing. They're going to be nodes. So they're going to be nodes with their own specific scripts attached to them. They'll be then placed inside of the player. The player will grab the variables or grab them as on-readies, and then it will call specific functionality depending on what needs to be done. Now, we can go a lot further with this, with state machines and things like that, and we will in the future. But for now, let's kind of just hammer down how this functions and get used to it a bit more, because once we've got these basic components set out, we will actually be able to move straight into creating an enemy, and we'll be able to do it quite quickly. So let's go back into our editor and kind of think about how this is done. I'm going to go into the player entity and into the script for it. Let me make this a little bit wider so it's a bit easier to see. And I'm going to zoom in one. There we go. Oh, it gets grumpy with me every time I try to zoom in. There we go. So in here we have the movement speed and jump speed. We also have gravity. And if we scroll down more, you can see that we've got a decently large or decently sized script of around 60 lines. There's something handling for flips, handling the jump, handling movement, inputs. Now, we don't want all of this stuff just jammed in the player because the player is really only supposed to exist as a container for everything that we need it to do. And that's where OOP comes in. OOP is all about having objects that do something specific and then being able to place those inside of a larger container to get that container to do something specific. Kind of how you would use Legos, really. I.e., you want to build something with Legos, you'll get a small block for the feet and then a couple of longer blocks for the legs and kind of go from there. So let's actually start moving some of this code around and putting it inside its own component system. And we'll also be doing the same for the camera at some point. But for now, let's go and create a new scene. This scene is going to be of 2D scene, so it's going to be of node 2D. We're just going to call this one the input handler. We're going to hit Control S and save. We'll go into scenes, create a new folder. We'll call this handlers. And then inside here, we're going to create another new folder, and we're going to create call this one player, because this is going to be the player specific handlers. The input handler is specific to the player. So that's going to go in there. And now we're going to add a script to this, and that's just going to be called input_handler. We hit create. Now, let's start looking into kind of what we want, right? We can go back to our player entity and we can see which inputs we're kind of using and what we're doing. And well, we've already got the code set out for this: handle movement input and handle jump input. So what I can actually do is I can just cut these out of this and then place it in the input handler. But before we do that, I'm going to do one really specific thing. At the very top here, I'm going to create a new line for basically move extends down one, create a new line at the top. I'm going to give this a class name. Classes are a very, very cool thing in this. Usually I use them to help with autocorrect and a few other things, and we'll probably end up diving a lot deeper into classes as they become more and more important. For this instance, I'm going to be giving all of my handlers a class name of sorts. So this class name will just be input handler. Give it a second to autocorrect or remove the errors, and there we go. So what this is going to be able to do is when I actually go into the player here and I want to create an onReady variable, we'll be able to create an onReady variable like this, where I'll be able to write the as keyword and then the class name, which would be in this case input handler, instead of like right here, sprite2d. Sprite2d is a class in and of itself. So let's move back into the code, and remember we have the code already sorted here, so I can just Control X, delete these two lines here, make it a little bit more pretty. We'll ignore the errors, and then I can do Control V, and this is the inputs that we want to handle, right? So I can hit Control S and save, and go back into Entity, and you'll start to see it's going to start throwing up a lot of issues now, a lot of errors. Well, that's because this specific, or these specific inputs here, we don't have anymore. We don't have the handle movement or handle jump input, right? Which means we now need to figure out a way of getting this to function just with the input handler as its own thing. So to do that, we're going to go to player entity. We're going to hit Control Shift and A. We're going to add the input handler. Now I'm going to hit Control S and save. I'm going to hold down and left click on the input handler so I can drag it around, drag it over, hold down Control, and it'll create an onReady variable for us. Or it'll freak out because it refused to do it that way. Do that again. There we go. So now we have an onReady variable for the input handler, and then I can type as input handler. This will give us easier autocorrect, which is kind of nice. And now, let's say for handling movement, right? Because we have in the input handler, we have these two functionalities. What I can now do is come down here and go if input handler, and then use a dot for the accessor. So dot handle movement input returns less than 0. Move my velocity.x in a certain direction, and then I can do the same thing for the velocity.x in the other direction. I hit Control S and save. Hell, we can even go one further. We can go and do input handler dot handle jump input. Hit Control S and save, and it will do the same thing. Now you'll notice our script is now just a little bit shorter, and it's using this new kind of handler that we've created, right? I'm going to create a space there so you can see the difference between the sprite and the input handler. Go back into the game, hit play. We'll see what happens. You'll see I'm still able to move and jump, but the code is now no longer just hosted in the player. The way that I like to look at this in a very, very simple way is you have all of these different components that do certain things, and there's going to be a lot for different things. And then the root node, or in this case, the player entity, the character body 2D, is the glue that holds them all together. It connects them all in certain ways and makes them function in certain ways. Now, we could go one step further and not even have to have this kind of on-ready line, because we know the input handler will always exist within the player because there's no reason why it shouldn't. When we create a movement handler, we should be able to create a exported variable specifically designed for the input handler. But there's a reason why I won't be doing that, and that's because I want my movement handler to be able to be used by everything that needs to move, not just the player entity. It's the same way with a health component, right? Or a health handler, something that handles the health of your character. You want it to, anything that needs to have the health can have that handler and not have any issues with it. So, and we'll be kind of putting that health or health related handler to use as well. We'll be creating one of those and I'll be going through that. So now let's move into the handle movement. Let's go and create another handler for a 2D scene, or as a 2D scene. We're going to call this one movement handler. Hit Control S and save. We'll be saving this one under just handlers in general, not under player, because we want everything that needs to be able to move to be able to use this. Make sure it's saved, go into script, create a new script, and you'll get used to this kind of process of giving a class name of movement handler. I will also listen, you'll hear me use the word handler and component interchangeably. Technically, that's incorrect. Handlers and components are, so components are what they are, and handlers are the functions kind of within them. But in this case, you'll just hear me use them kind of interchangeably. So for this, we're going to want kind of access to a few things, right? We're going to want access to the thing that we want to move. So in this case, we're going to need to know, if we actually take a look at the code here, we're going to need to know what thing we're moving, what has velocity. We're going to need to know the move speed, and we're going to need the delta. So let's create a new function inside of our movement handler. So func, and we're going to call this handle underscore movement like we did before. Then we're going to give it a few types of parameters now, not just one, not just two. We more than likely will end up doing 3. So the first thing we're going to want to do is grab the character body it plans on moving, right? So I'm just going to call this character body, character underscore body, so it's very clear. It's going to be of type character body 2D, so it knows that that's the specific type we're looking for. We're then going to be needing a direction, so we're going to grab an input underscore so input direction. Now let's have a quick look at how we've got the input handler going. We've got this going from a floating point number. Now that can work for AI as well. We can get that working for AI in certain ways, which we may have to end up doing. So let's just grab that. Let's call this input dir, and we'll set it as a float so it'll know left or right. And then we'll do one more, and this is going to be for delta. And delta, of course, is also. And this is not going to need any return type, so we'll just do void, and we'll leave it like that. So we're going to want to check two things. If we go back to our input handler, or our player entity, and just check the if statements here, we're going to need to check if the movement direction is less than 0 or greater than 0, right? So back into the movement handler, we'll just go if, and then we'll grab input dir is less than 0. We want to do something. I'll write pass for now because we don't know what we want to do yet. And then I'll do one more. If input dir is greater than 0, we'll pass. Now, we also need this. This is a setting our velocity back to 0 if we let go of the button. But for that, I'm going to create a new function inside of our movement handler. And I'm going to just call it func handle underscore deceleration. Give it a void return type in pass, and I'm going to give it 2 parameters. I'm going to give it the character body. Actually, I just only need 1 parameter. It just needs to be the character underscore body of type character body 2D. We could actually, let's give it delta as well. We'll give it delta, and there we go. So we've got this kind of deceleration function now. So let's actually make it decelerate something. So to do that, all we need to do is call the character body, because the character body is preset now to a character body 2D. That is the type that this is. And character body 2Ds have a dot velocity. And because we only want to handle deceleration going in the x-axis, we can go dot velocity dot x, and then we can just set that equal to 0, like that. And this will do the exact same thing as this statement here. We just need to call it in a certain area. And to do that, for now, to keep this as simple and as similar as our original movement code, we're going to call it at the top of our handle movement script. So we're just going to write handle deceleration, and then we're going to call the character body. We'll pass in the delta as well, because we're getting the character body from the inputs from handle movement and from delta. So that handles the deceleration. We now need to handle the acceleration. So to handle the acceleration, what do we need? Well, going back to the player entity, we're going to need a movement speed. Well, that's not actually in this component yet. So let's actually go and do that at export movement underscore speed. Var movement speed, give an int, call it, or set it equal to 0 for now, because that's what we're going to want our quote unquote base to be at. If we want to check what we found as a good variable here, we can kind of scroll up and we can have a look around, but we don't need to. These are things we'll figure out ourselves. And now we just need to do this. We just need to set our X depending on the direction, right? So right here, we'll grab the character body 2D. So character body dot velocity equals negative movement speed times that by delta. And that, oh, there we go, I forgot the dot X at the end of that. There we go. And that handles the direction for going left. Let's copy and paste this. So it's the direction going right. Remove that minus, hit Control S and save. And now we have a very separate movement, or like very basic movement system, but it's not connected to anything, and it doesn't need, like, it's not actually coupled to anything in general. So we can now attach this to anything. We could attach this to an enemy, and say we create an AI handler or an AI component. It will pass in itself, i.e. the enemy itself will pass in its own character body into here. The input direction would be like, okay, where's the player at? That's going to be the direction we want to move in. And then it'll pass in delta from its physics process. That way we're starting to get this kind of flow with our code, and it's kind of just buildable like Lego blocks would be. So let's actually go and put this to use in the player entity and make sure it's hooked up correctly. Once again, under player entity, we're going to go Control-Shift-A to add. We're going to add the movement handler. We'll create an onReady variable for the movement handler. Because we gave it a class name, we can do as movement handler. We can now completely remove the move speed variable. And we can scroll down. We can remove the entire handle movement function. And then we can go into our physics process here. And all we have to call is movement speed or movement handler dot handle movement. And now we just need to pass in the character body, the input direction, and delta. So self will be the character body because we want the character or the player entity's character body specifically, and that would be self. So we want self. Now we're going to want an input direction. Well, that one's also simple. We have an input handler dot, and we're going to want the dot from handle movement input. And then finally, we want to pass in delta. And that is our movement handled. Now, if I hit Control S and save, then I click play, and you'll see we are not moving. Now, the reason for us not moving is because we haven't set the movement variable up in the movement handler yet. So let's go movement. We click on the movement handler, which will be at the bottom here. Then we go over to the right. We set up the movement variable in here. So let's go and change this to 100. Control S and save, F5. And now we are moving, albeit very slowly. So let's go and set this to 6,000, which I think was what the original variable was at, give or take. There we go. We're now moving left and right, and we can still, jump. And now we're starting to kind of build this handler system out. When we're done with this, we'll actually be able to, once again, move on to enemies. So you'll notice the only thing I'm actually going to have to really call in here will be move and slide. So let's first do a jump handler. So let's go 2D scene, kind of get through this process again, call it jump handler, Control S and save. This is not going to be player specific, so we're going to hit save. Now we're going to look at our jump code. Okay, we're going to add a new script to the jump handler. Give it a class underscore name of jump handler. Control S and save again. Once again, check this. We'll just Control C, copy this, move it over to here. Now we're going to need a variable in here as well, at export var for the jump speed, which is going to be of type flow, and we'll set it equal to, I think 300 is what we had it set to originally. Press and save, and you'll see there's a bunch of errors because it now needs to do certain things. Well, to do this, we're going to need to, one, get the input handler for handling the jump. Well, that's going to be a Boolean input, is underscore jumping is what we call it. We'll set that equal to a bool. and it's going to need to get the character body is on floor. So to do that, we also just need to pass in the character body. To keep this kind of coded the same way in a lot of the handlers that we do, we'll be setting up the parameters kind of in a certain order. So it will always be the character underscore body first. And then we'll have the other parameters coming after that. That way this is always a thing. And now I can change this. Now I can go if is underscore jumping and character body dot is on floor. Now I misspelled body, so I'm going to change that and make sure that looks fine. Now we're going to need to do the jump speed and the velocity. Well, to do that, we just need to, once again, grab the character body dot velocity dot y, and then the jump speed, which we've also set up here. I can hit Control S and save. Then I can go back into main. I can go into the player entity. We can go and add the jump handler to our player entity. We can remove the handling jump code, create an onReady variable for the jump handler as jump handler, remove handle jump, and then we can just call the jump handler dot handle jump, not jump speed, dot handle jump, pass in self, and we're going to want to pass in the is jumping boolean. And to pass that in, once again, we can just go into our input handler dot handle jump input, and that will return true or false depending on if we've pressed space. And there is no slef, and that's because I misspelled self. Now let's hit Control S and save. Play it again, make sure it's functioning. And it's functioning completely okay. And finally, there are two more processes here that we want to handle, two more functions we want to handle. Flip, we're going to want to handle flipping. So I'm going to cut that out, create another new scene. This is going to be the flip handler, because everything's going to want to flip that moves. Control S and save it in the overall folder or the kind of overarching folder. Create a new script, flip handler, give it the same code. We're going to need to pass in the character body, of course, which is once again of type character body. And that's it. We just need to add character body to the start of these velocities. So character body dot at the very beginning. Hit Control S and save, or you'll notice here that there is a little bit of an issue that we're going to run into with this one, and that's calling the sprite 2D. And that is because we don't actually have access to the sprite 2D like this. We could go like this and then call sprite2d.flipPage, and so that's false. But this relies on kind of everything being set up in a very, very specifically same way. Now, chances are that every character body we have will have a sprite. We're going to want it to have a sprite. But if on the off chance that that doesn't happen, one thing that you can do is actually basically set an export variable up for this and then just set the sprite via the inspector. But we're not going to need to do that because everything that we create that requires a character body will require a sprite 2D. So it will always have this functionality. So I'm going to hit Control S and save. I'm going to go back to the player entity, repeat the process of adding the flip handler to player entity, hit Control S and save, create an onReady variable for this. We can actually remove jump speed in the player variable category as well, since we're cleaning our script up as we go. Rename the onReady variable, we're going to set it as a flip handler. Come down here, grab the flip handler, then dot handle flip, passing in self again, Control S and save. And that handles literally everything other than gravity. Now, we could, if we really want to, create an entire component just for handling gravity. And that's not entirely a bad idea. There are many other ways of doing it. Personally, if you want to go and, there is no real wrong way of handling gravity in this sense, but if you want to go and check and do this yourself, go and test the process that I've given you with how we set up our handlers and what you have to pass in. So for applying gravity, you're going to need to pass in a character body and a delta or a gravity variable. It's going to need a gravity variable and a delta variable. It's going to need a character body for grabbing the is on floor and the velocity. And you're just going to need to set it the same way. that pretty much handles all of our kind of componentizing. We've removed around 20 lines of code to this, and that's not that bad. And we've kind of got just 2 functions now, or 3 functions, in a kind of much better place. And what this really kind of allows us to do is, say our movement needs to be changed. And we will actually be changing the math behind our movement to add things like acceleration, deceleration, speed boosts, and things like that. But if we need to change that and we need to go through every single entity that we create and every single movement script they have, that will become a massive pain in the ass real quick. Whereas having one handler that handles movement and just being able to throw this onto anything that we want it to, we can go and change how the movement functions for all of them at once. And if we want to go and create a specific type of movement, say a specific movement pattern for something, well, we can create a inherited version of the movement handler. So we want something to handle flight, which means we're going to want to move it in X and Y, like axis at the same time. So up, down, left, and right. And it's not going to need a jump handler at that point, right? So for that, we would just do some more inputs and then change the movement speed based off of that, or change the velocity based off of that. That way it wouldn't affect the movement handler, but you'd have a lot of this basic code kind of inherited from the movement handler. I really hope this hasn't been too confusing. OOP and handlers and component systems can be a little bit complex. I do have another video about the handler system, which might be a better explanation if this has been a bit too confusing. If it has, I suggest you go check that out. But that pretty much covers everything that I kind of wanted to cover today. And using this, we're going to be able to move into enemies in the next video, which is I'm really looking forward to. That's going to be a lot of fun. So for now, let's hit play and make sure that I went and checked that the flipping is working, which it is, and the jumping, everything is still working. This is still being picked up. Grand. With that done, yeah, I'll have to see you in the next video. I hope you've had a good day. I hope you're enjoying your game dev journey, and I will see you